All right, I think we should probably get started. Welcome everyone to this special seminar this early afternoon. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just say a few words of thanks to the sponsor here. My name is Abidin Kusno, and I'm a faculty member of Environmental Studies and also member of the International Advisory Board of the MCRI. I want to, first of all, of course, thank our leader here, Roger, who is behind all this series of global suburbanism. And one of the important contributions of this large project is this whole lecture series that will, in the end, lead, which was, well, when we had nothing better to do in the airport, this idea came up. And we are just very pleased to have this lecture series over here. But in the end, this will all be culminated in the final conference, which I should register in people's mind the date, which is in October, from October 19 to October 21, which is going to take place at York University. And they have this already really interesting title called After Suburbia. You know, after, but what we have over here is maybe the renewal of the suburbia, not after anymore. After suburbia, extended urbanization and life on the planet's periphery. So that is the whole ultimate conference that we have in mind. And this lecture series, including today's one, is going to lead up to that final meeting. So let me now introduce our speaker today, Professor Ellen Dunham-Jones. She's a very well-known and very well-regarded professor, as well as in some way, you know, someone who can actually influence policymakers as well. This is what we really admire about her. She's teaching at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and she's also directing the MS in Urban Studies, Urban Design degree. I should probably mention that this is actually the second round of her talk. In the morning, we had a very special student session, you know, and I can tell people immediately that our speaker today has a very interesting theoretical, conceptual, practical, as well as what is more important is the kind of real issues that you can immediately feel from her talk. Yeah. Case studies with historical component, a list of questions, and the conversation is going to continue this afternoon. It would be a bit redundant for me to introduce the whole set of things that have been produced by Professor Dunham-Jones, and that is just so unnecessary, but nevertheless, I must mention the award-winning book, Retrofitting Suburbia, Urban Design Solutions for Redesigning Suburbs. It has been, you know, reprinted many times, and there's a Mandarin Chinese version as well, which was published in 2013. You can immediately see there's a spread now of this new idea to different parts of the world. And I shouldn't mention anything about the book. Yeah, it will come out in the talk. I should just mention that there's another book that is in the process of writing now. It is worth mentioning. It is tentatively titled The Retrofitting Suburbia Case Studies, Designs for 21st Century Challenges. So let me now turn this forum over to Professor Dunham-Jones, and please join me to welcome Professor Dunham-Jones. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And should I stand here or here?
If you like, I think you can control.
Yeah, it's easier for me. Okay, great. So thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. It's been great to learn more from you on the global side of suburbia. Most of my work really has focused on the US, but you know, when June and I wrote the first book, we had about 80 case studies. My database now has over 1,400, and that's without really being very systematic about it, just kind of geeking out on it and filling it in when I have time. I maintain, I believe, the world's only database that tracks what I deem to be successful examples of where dead big box, dying office parks, dead malls, strip malls, commercial strip corridors, garden apartment complexes, subdivisions, golf courses, branch banks, you name it, prototypical suburban property types have been retrofitted one way or another into more sustainable places. And I won't show all the case studies, it'll just feel like it. But one of the ways, June and I really are both trained as architects and who have become urban designers. And one simple way to kind of categorize all of these 1,400 case studies is according to 3 simple retrofit strategies. So on the one hand, re-inhabiting the existing box with more community-serving uses. There's loads of examples of just, whether it's a dead big box store, a dead mall, and it's now being reused as a school, as a library, as a church, whatever, various kinds of examples. Then the second strategy is redevelopment. Where there's a strong enough market, demolishing the existing boxes and building in a much more urban, walkable, compact, transit-served manner, often really creating the downtowns that a lot of suburbs never had. So right now, the dead malls get a lot of attention. Retail is really tanking, quite at crisis levels in the US. So there are about 283 malls that are being retrofitted right now in the US, and 50 of those are becoming the downtowns, 27 already, another 30-some on the way, that really are becoming truly mixed-use downtowns. But not every place has a strong enough market to do that. And the third strategy is regreening. Demolishing the box, depaving the parking lots, reconstructing the wetlands, building parks, community gardens, whatever is kind of the need, often because we never should have built there in the first place. So especially in the US, prior to the Clean Water Act of 1970, it was absolutely common to build on top of creeks, to drain the wetlands. And those now, with climate change and more severe storms, more pavement, upstream, we're seeing a lot of those culverts fail. We're seeing a lot more flooding. And so there's I feel right now one of the biggest challenges we have is that of the 1,400 examples, only 2% are regreenings. And we need way, way more to be able to really, I think, provide much more resilience. But it's interesting to just so I just track and kind of watch where these things go and really see what the opportunities, I think, are that are out there. So I usually, though, start by kind of saying, suburbanization has provided, certainly US and Canada, generations of families with access to the American dream, much beloved landscapes. But that's a lot of those suburbs are going to hold value for a very long time. They're leafy, beloved places, especially those built in the 20s. The post-war suburbs are starting to really show their age. They're 50, 70 years old, and especially the commercial properties are not aging well. They weren't designed to really last. And so we're just starting to see tremendous sort of unintended consequences of suburbanization. And I don't think I really need to go into detail. You guys can read the slides here. But we all recognize when the suburbs were first built, there were a lot of people loved to drive around. Gas was cheap. That was the modern way to live, was to have all the uses separated out and connected only by roads and cars. Now we recognize that, oh my God, you do that. And when the suburbs were first built, most households only had one car. Today, most suburban households have two, if not even a third if they have teenagers. The levels of traffic were not really anticipated. Public health, I think, is a really interesting one because starting in the 1890s, the suburbs were always marketed as the healthy place to raise a family because the big health threat was fear of infectious diseases in the overcrowded cities. Today, infectious diseases are not the #1 health threat in certainly in North America. The #1 health threat are chronic diseases that have to do with our behavior, sedentary behavior in particular, leading to lack of physical activity and obesity, leading to diabetes, heart disease. In the US, obesity is at epidemic levels. I don't know, but I'm going to guess that that's also pretty true for Canada. And sadly, research shows that human sprawl and suburban sprawl correlate. We're still having some trouble quite getting that into causality data, but it's just all sort of going, just all begins to kind of layer in that the suburbs are not as healthy as we thought. They're also not as young as we thought. We all think of the suburbs as family focused. That's not who lives there. In the US, since 2000, 2/3 of suburban households have not had children in them. We're getting close to 70% of suburban households do not have children in them because the baby boom generation, who the suburbs were first built as the baby boom after the post-war, they live in the suburbs, they've lived there their whole lives, they raised their children have grown. They're empty nesters now, and most of them are starting to hit retirement. They're still in the suburbs, so you have an aging population. The silver tsunami kind of, that frankly has built a habitat. They're going to have some challenges in aging gracefully in. The day we all have to take the car keys from the clenched fists is nobody's favorite thing to consider. So, all of these things kind of add up. Lots of affordability issues when you start adding in transportation costs. And the other really quite surprising, unintended, or at least underknown fact is that in the US, since 2005, more Americans in poverty have been living in suburbs than living in cities. That number, that's before our recession, and those numbers escalated dramatically. Atlanta, where I live, is #1 in the suburbanization of poverty. We've had a 162% increase. We have now, just way more of the poor living in suburbs and continually kind of getting pushed further and further away from where public services are, where all the nonprofits that tend to help, where, so lots of different challenges, sort of 21st century challenges are emerging that the 20th century suburbs just were never designed for. So if that isn't depressing enough, then we get all the vacant properties. 1/3 of our enclosed malls are dead or dying. We don't really know exactly how many strip malls or how many dead big box there are at any given time, but everybody sees them. Every community has them, and everyone sees them. The office parks and corporate campuses are emerging now as, I think, one of the biggest threats to a lot of suburban economies. We're beginning to see great numbers of the exact same corporations that fled the cities in the late 70s and 80s out to the brand new shiny office parks are now, those office parks are kind of tired. The infrastructure is not so shiny around them. And those employers are increasingly moving back into the recently reinvested in downtowns where all the digitally savvy millennials are that they're hoping to hire. So we're seeing dramatic reversals and real impacts on local suburban tax revenues and budgets. But, so you can either, again, at this point, just get really, really depressed. and it is depressing to see this stuff, and it depresses property values, and nobody likes to kind of see underperforming properties in their neighborhoods. Or I now have gotten to the point, when I see this stuff, I see opportunity. I mean, honestly, these are the sites. These are where we get to now address all of those unintended consequences, all of those new challenges. It's on, without tearing down another tree, without just destroying another wetland. These are the sites that we can go back in and repair and reconstruct and really try to help help the suburbs become more sustainable, more resilient, more affordable, more equitable. So, and I'm not the only one. I mean, so a lot of the reason I've got over 1,400 examples, is because a lot of developers have begun to recognize this. So there's these, the huge demographic shifts is really what's driving the market. And I don't have comparisons on Canadian numbers, but I'm going to assume it's not that different. But so again, as I already sort of described, you've got the baby boom generation now, for the most part, in childless households, in suburban houses. You've also got then after the baby boom, then it's Gen X. Gen X are folks in their 40s, early 50s. For the most part, most of them live in the suburbs. Most of them are raising children, but they're a small generation. At least in the US, there just aren't enough Gen Xers to fill all the existing single-family homes that the baby boomers will vacate. Then you get the millennials, most of you guys. The millennials are an enormous generation, even slightly bigger than the baby boom. Their parents are the boomers. They grew up in the suburbs, and they think they're boring. The boomers, for the most part, the boomers kind of grew up watching TV shows like Law and Order, Hill Street Blues, where the cities are portrayed as crime-ridden places, even though there are good social servants who try to make things right. The millennials grew up watching Friends and Seinfeld. The city's a fun place. It's clean, it's safe, it's full of wacky, kind of quirky, interesting people and fun times. Now, the reality is, both of those stereotypes have a certain grain of truth in them. The cities had not been invested in. There was more crime in the downtowns, in the cities, in the 70s and 80s. Today, there's less. There's more. There not all, but there has been a significant change. Now, the millennials are starting to, they put off getting married, put off having kids as long as they possibly could, but they are starting now. And we are starting to see mom and pop millennials moving out to the suburbs more and more. I think they're going to bring with them a lot of that interest, though, in more urban lifestyles. We're certainly seeing that. We're also seeing that the millennials, overwhelmingly in surveys, they say they want to live in the city, but they can't really afford it. It's gotten really expensive. And B, the fact is most of the jobs are out in the suburbs. In the US, 82% of jobs are more than 3 miles from the central business district. About 66%, depending on, it's all, there's different measures of what's a suburb or not. But so you have the millennials wanting an urban lifestyle, but their jobs and the cheaper versions of that urban lifestyle are increasingly out in the suburbs. The aging boomers, on the other hand, are in the suburbs. They want to stay in the suburbs. They want to age in place. But now that they don't have the kids have grown, they really don't want to take care. A lot of them don't want to take care of the big lawn. The privacy that they loved while raising their family, now as they're starting to hit retirement, becomes kind of lonely. Demographers like to sometimes use the term to refer to the boomers as yeepies, youthful, energetic, elderly people into everything. They want to volunteer, they want to be active, they want to walk places. Their vision of retirement is not moving into some assisted living or seniors only community. they're actually looking for a more urban lifestyle, but in their same community. They want to stay in the community with their friends and their family and their doctors. So you're seeing both of the two biggest demographic groups having an interest in a more urban lifestyle, but located in the suburbs. And that's driving an enormous market shift. So this slide here is, this is in Atlanta. This is the Perimeter Center Mall, and it's surrounded by a whole lot of perimeter center office parks. It's an edge city, but I mean, the name alone, Perimeter Center, tells you how ambiguous, how in flux. I mean, it's like, make up your mind. You're one or the other. You can't, you can't really be both. When Perimeter Center was built, when it was on the Perimeter Highway, the land was cheap. It made sense to build surface parking lots. And when you ask most Atlantans, can you do something at Perimeter Center? Most of them will say, no, it's totally built out. You can't do anything there. That slide's about 80% surface parking lots. If you start building on top of those parking lots, yes, there's enormous potential. And there is a rapid trail, our MARTA, which is our rail system station right there. The mall is staying as it is, but other than the mall, everything else on this slide is being redeveloped, about 10 million square feet coming in because that MARTA station is there. A lot of office, quite a lot of residential as well. For office, it's the sweet spot. It's kind of near the end of the line. So all the millennials who want to live in Midtown can take rail to work, and all the baby boomers who are still working, who are out in the even farther suburbs, drive in but don't have to drive all the way into downtown. And we see this pattern over and over in a lot of communities. So Perimeter Center has kind of made, it was on the perimeter, but actually because the region has leapfrogged, and sprawl has just expanded so much, it actually is now the geographic center of Metro Atlanta. And so it now has the opportunity to actually urbanize, and that is exactly what is happening. And part of why it's happening is because there is such a market now for walkable urbanism. Chris Leinberger is a professor at George Washington University who has been trying to really analyze. I consulted with him on his Atlanta study. He has a methodology for really trying to figure out, exactly identify what are the regionally significant walkable urban places, he calls them walk-ups, in a metro, and to then see how much real estate value is accrued for that. So in Atlanta, we found that combining, the average, but for the retail rent, the residential rent, or the commercial rent was 112% rent premium. So basically, landlords are getting double the rent if they're in a walkable area. That has shifted the needle significantly now, so that most development, just barely, but most, is now taking place in those walk-ups. We're still seeing sprawl continuing, but we're also seeing a lot more densification. And so that's sort of, I think, the setup. So now get into the case studies. And I've organized them by the different challenges. So certainly the number one challenge is still, can we reduce dependence on the automobile? Because that one has so many cascading effects on kind of everything else, health, stormwater, everything else. So the strategies, obviously we try to increase walkability, multimodal. I'm going to focus in particular on sort of walkability, road diets, and street networks. So sometimes, though, one of the things that really one has to recognize is that when a property dies, it often means the market has moved on, and the market is not very strong. So there are different, the different strategies, re-inhabitation, redevelopment, regreening, are very much in response to what are the market conditions. Sometimes one is going to work more incrementally and really anticipate kind of more further urbanization later. So this was a 3-story mall in Englewood, Colorado, about 9 miles outside of Denver. When it died, they re-inhabited the old department store at one of the department stores as a civic center. It happened to be on the very first of Denver's new light rail stations stops. So there's a station here, made a plaza, some public realm, quite a lot of housing, quite affordable housing, very urban streetscape. But the market was not there to be all urban, so there's Walmart. Here's a bunch of out parcels. But they knew that Walmart's not going to be there forever. Walmart never is. The lifespan's not that long. And they were able to convince Walmart, design your parking lots as future building sites. So don't let the water hookup go underneath, just diagonally to wherever the closest hookup is on the street. Put all your utilities and your street trees in use your drive lanes of your parking lot as the future streets. By the time Walmart dies, those trees are going to be mature and lovely, and you've got a really great setup for future development. So that's an example of kind of the incremental when the market is kind of weak. Here's an example. This was the example that I presented in the meeting with the graduate students earlier today, of a very strong market, and really a much more, this one is really a developer-led project with still a very significant role for the public sector. This is a 400-acre area centered on this metro station called White Flint in Maryland, about a 30-minute metro ride from Washington, D.C. The area also really centers on Rockville Pike, about an 8-lane, very congested, usually highway. And it's this mishmash of, there are some taller buildings, office and residential, but also a lot of just sort of sprawling parking lot. It's a miserable walk. There are sidewalks, but no one, I take my students and we're the only people out there. So the county sort of told the developers, look, we're going to do a new plan. The developers came back and said, let us have a shot at it, because the 6 major property owners also owned property throughout DC, and in particular, Bethesda, just 2 stops down, used to look like this. And Bethesda started investing in really redevelopment to have buildings closer to the sidewalks, a more walkable street grid. And so the developers knew that they said, we're only getting half the rent here of the folks down of our properties in Bethesda. So that the developers brought in Gladding Jackson, a very good firm, to propose new street grid. So all the dotted lines are new public streets to be built on the private land of these developers, and with the developers agreeing to an additional 10% tax on their property tax to pay for that construction of public streets on their private land. In exchange, they get to build up to 30 stories. If they build all the way up to 30 stories, they also have to purchase transfer of development rights that help to protect the open space that the county has as well. The county has committed to, they have not yet gotten funding, they haven't finished the designs yet, but to also retrofit Rockville Pike and put bus rapid transit in the median down the center, dramatically widen the sidewalks, put it on a road diet. So here's the first built 30-story building, really lovely and remarkably effective at sound buffering bioswale alongside the parking lot right next to the big Rockville Pike. Here's a 30-acre strip mall here's what it looked like 2 years ago. Here's what build out is projected. So dramatic, changes occurring. And at the same time, this is Montgomery County, so there's a big commitment to affordable inclusionary zoning. They were actually even going for higher than what the IZ usually requires, 25% affordable. And this is really moving ahead. I mean, it took, because it's being, I think, so pushed by the developers, I think they broke ground on the first building within 6 years of the start of this process, which is pretty remarkable. Meanwhile, the county's still working on the bus rapid transit, but it's coming. So, you know, that's an ambitious project. I mean, we see in Canada, I mean, also, I think, very ambitious kind of transit-oriented developments. But in Canada, I keep seeing now they're building on top of the malls. We tend to demolish, our malls are dying, we demolish them and then put in the street grid. The strategy, certainly in Vancouver, this is Oak Ridge Mall, there's a new transit, the Canada Line just put in a new transit station, so now very ambitious high-rise housing on top has been permitted on top of the mall. And Brentwood also just outside in BC, in the Vancouver metro area, very much under construction with new high-rises on top of the malls. But not so much attention to street grid. So it's just a different, I think it's more of the super grid system, different sort of approaches. So as I said, in the US, the approach, there has been a lot more emphasis, I think, on that establishment of a walkable street grid. So this is Belmar, also in the Colorado area, about 6 miles from Denver, downtown. And this was a 100-acre super block with a 1.2 million square foot big regional mall. You know, people loved their mall. I mean, the high school actually would have their prom at the mall. The mall was the de facto downtown. Lakewood was a group of 7 subdivisions that incorporated to avoid annexation from Denver. But they never had a downtown. When the mall died, the community initially, the land defaulted to the city for lack of payment. The city initially tried to find a developer to fix the mall. No takers, no developers. We have not built a conventional new mall since 2006 in the US. And it's just, but they did find a very good developer actually who said, we will give you the downtown you never had. It is today 22 blocks of public streets with very walkable. 2 of the main streets have retail at ground level. It maxes out at 5 stories. A lot of different housing types. You know, it doesn't look totally cookie cutter. It's, I think, really, it doesn't have any that is super affordable. It's new construction. It does have good connectivity, not great. They at least, you know, they aligned hoping that eventually they can connect through where they weren't able to in the first, you know, when they went ahead. They tripled density, but they did not need to add a single new traffic light or widen a single lane around it because the mix of uses, they're capturing about 45% internal trips. So there's this endless testimonials of the folks who live there sort of saying, you know, yeah, I still commute to work, but once I'm home, I do all my trips just in the neighborhood. I walk. And it's generating way more property tax and sales tax than the mall did at its peak. So it's really quite I think this one was particularly well done. It's been an interesting one to continue to watch as it evolves. So here's a map of downtown Denver. There's Belmar I just showed. There's Englewood, the other one, the anticipatory one. 8 of the 13 regional malls in the Denver metro area have now been retrofitted. You know, the public sector, the private sector have sort of figured out how to make this work. Now, it's important to emphasize, not a single family house was demolished here. This is not about taking away anybody's choice of what their existing choices are of how to live. It's about on dead or dying malls adding opportunities for an urban lifestyle for that growing part of the demographic that are choosing that. So, you know, it's responding to market, but what it does also mean is, okay, we end up with these pockets of drive-to walkability. If we really want to get more sustainable, we need to connect the dots, literally, and we need to start retrofitting the corridors. And that could be its own whole lecture. But anyway, so there's a lot of work going on in terms of retrofitting the corridors. So this is one of the ones that's is the furthest along, because these take a long time. So this is a 3.5-mile stretch in Northern Virginia in the DC area. And the strategy was to upzone at the 4 main intersections using a form-based code. So this corridor, here's the before image, and it's an old road, actually. Very old, goes back to colonial times at one level, but it's mostly it's kind of 60s, 70s vintage. Some larger apartment, a few larger apartment buildings, but a lot of just parking lot oriented strip malls and things. In the last 30 years, one new building on this 3.5-mile corridor, a CVS, where it was a 1-year negotiated process to get a brick facade on the CVS. That was the big community benefit. Otherwise, it's a totally standard CVS. So now what the form-based code does is there are a lot of negotiation with the neighborhoods well in advance before an actual project was being proposed, but that agreeing to allow up to 12 stories right along the corridor, but a requirement that the massing tapers down to 3 where it meets the existing single-family home neighborhoods right behind. So form-based is it's controlling the massing more than the use. The additional tax revenue from that increased density then is being proposed to help support a streetcar. So we've seen in loads of cases that as you extend the transit out, you trigger redevelopment. This was saying, can we reverse this? Can we actually increase the density and then we upzone, at what become the future stops? And then in the process also, we deliberately do not upzone in between because we're trying to preserve the existing affordable housing. That strategy, they wish now, the rents have gone up, just the hint that transit is coming. The rents have already gone up, and the county regrets that they wish they could have really set up some land banks and done some even more aggressive things along that the affordability is still extremely challenged in these strong markets. As you might have heard, we had an election recently where some more conservative people were elected, and that includes in this jurisdiction, and the transit is no longer being supported, but hopefully it'll come back later. We'll see. But the interesting thing is that even during the recession, so the minute this form-based code was adopted, 2004 or so, and even as the recession hit, 6 new mixed-use urban buildings went forward. So the form-based code actually is being credited with really, actually stimulating development along a corridor that had not seen any in quite some time. Another corridor retrofit, I love this one. Lancaster, California is a suburb of Los Angeles, and this is their main street, the ubiquitous 5-laner. For decades, the main street had been losing shops to the mall, and the answer had always been, we need to widen the road, make it easier for people to get downtown. No, it just made it easier to zip through downtown going 50 miles an hour. So then they did the opposite, put their street on a road diet. They went from 5 lanes to 2, put the parking in the middle, in between street trees and street lights. Made this really quite remarkably beautiful place that now during festivals, they've got this incredible sort of ramblas, but on every day, now they've also slowed the traffic to 20 miles an hour. There's a saying, 20 is plenty. If a pedestrian is hit by a car going 22 miles an hour, chances are the pedestrian lives. 23, no. We should never have speed limits more than 20 miles an hour anywhere we want walkable, we want people around. What happens is that then, okay, gosh, you slowed the traffic and you condensed down to 2, it should be a traffic nightmare. No, because now the cars can actually, they're going more slowly, but they can snug right up to each other. You get just as much throughput at rush hour. And actually now people can actually look and see, oh, there's a sale at such and such, pull into the parking. Businesses, new businesses are doing really well. They're pulling from the mall now. The cut-in traffic collisions, lots and lots of good stories on this one. They didn't change curb and gutter. This was really not expensive to do. They did this during the recession with stimulus funds, and it's really quite a remarkable transformation. Sometimes the transformations to corridors can start with something as simple as an intersection. This in Washington, D.C., an intersection with really wide turning radii, completely designed so that cars can keep going 50 miles an hour, even though there's a transit station right here, one of the most underused transit stations. DC Planning Department came in and said, we want to make that a regular 90-degree intersection so it's easier for pedestrians to cross. In the process, we're recovering all that public land that we can now give at reduced rates for affordable housing that is now near the affordable transit. The first new housing has gone up with housing above a Walmart, very urban Walmart. These 1940s older apartments are also getting redone now as senior housing. So 100% replacement units for all of the folks in here who are, frankly, now all seniors. So they're interesting, again, just rethinking an intersection can trigger quite a lot of change. There's also some interesting things, and this is near Atlanta, increasing connectivity more by bike and walk. So this is Technology Park is a 1,400-acre office park, 1970s, one of the big, so this is the office park, and then the city is you can barely see, but the little cul-de-sac-y curly stuff around it. The office park already they're recognizing they need to make this more attractive to the millennials. So they actually have invented now millennial housing. They're calling it that in their official documents. This is the first new millennial housing, but then they've named the project Twin Lakes, which is just so 70s and so not millennial. But anyway, what's cool about this project is that they've decided to expand. They already had something of a trail system in the office park. They're expanding the trail system out into the city. And the city has now set up a zoning category specifically to encourage property owners to donate land to the trail system to better connect housing and jobs and really integrate and kind of say, look, you can bike, everybody, you can bike to work. It's not that, it's a small enough city to make that actually work really potentially pretty well. The other thing to add to that walkability, bikeability is that I think is a really a great technique is just liner buildings. So here, Crystal City is another one of these big master planned office parks, pretty grim at ground level, but also pretty familiar, and so the developer has now built just these skinny little buildings for restaurants and retail that are just 1 or 2 stories that are just filling out that space to the street, creating now that kind of the cafes, making a much more attractive, much more vibrant, walkable street network as the amenity, which is now going to start to bring in much more residential and a lot, still more office, but a lot more residential density into this, which is they have a transit station too. So urbanism is increasingly really being seen as the amenity for office. I mean, there's just no question about it. So the office parks are increasingly figuring out, okay, how do we bring in more residents so that the restaurants that were open for lunch now can stay open for dinner. We start to get that nightlife. We start to create a much more vibrant, more urban place. But sometimes that liner strategy can also work in a much more modest way. This is just a simple one, but I think is so effective. So this was an existing parking lot that used to go, the parking lot went all the way to the street. And then this is just a little apartment building that's raised up. So the ground floor is still parking. It's parking for a layer of affordable apartments that are just little walk-ups up above the parking spaces. So it's not taking away any parking, but it's now adding a little bit of affordable housing. So these are the windows at the street. They're just open air. You're looking at the cars, but it's making such a nicer streetscape to walk by, very modest, and is a very, very affordable. A little handicapped unit on the corner that's at ground. So as I said, jobs, the office parks are closing. The suburbs are really seeing a new challenge now in how do they attract and retain young people who want to fly to go to the cities. So the urbanization of the office parks, trying to bring more urbanism, is certainly one of the strategies. There are also office parks that are recognizing that they're better off regreening. They've got these big white elephants of nobody wants an Aetna Insurance had one of the largest suburban office buildings outside of Hartford. When they moved their employees back to Hartford, they demolished the building because they knew they'd have a better chance selling the land without a building than with a sort of 1970s white elephant. But the jobs picture is also about growing your workforce, and I really love this example. In Austin, Texas, Austin Community College really specializes in trying to educate people for middle wage, middle skill jobs, not the super high tech, but in recognizing that those jobs do require more proficiency in mathematics than most of our population has. And so they, when a mall, the Highland Mall died, JCPenney, they took over the JCPenney department store. And so they, instead of chopping it up into a whole bunch of little classrooms, they made one big 600-foot-long computer lab. They reinvented the teaching of math. Students sit at the computer and they work on modules kind of at their own pace. Instructors put on red jackets. They kind of look like Walmart greeters. And if a student needs help, they put a red cup on top, and then the instructor comes over and helps them. They've cut attrition from math classes 50%, which is especially important, really, I think, for the kind of job and education we need. Then the rest of them, they bought the rest of the dead mall. They've now leased the other anchor space to a high-tech cloud computing company, and part of the lease is you have to hire 100 of our interns every semester. That's going really well. They've now also formed a partnership with a developer to build housing on top of the parking lots, which is the housing is very much oriented to the students, though anybody can rent it. And then they've got they're putting in a green, and they did just open recently the transit station that is on that line. So you're really getting kind of redevelopment, regreening, reinhabitation, all working together, I think, and growing that job, the market, the kind of workforce that is needed. But again, other examples of just urbanism really being the amenity, the driver. Santana Row in San Jose, you can't really see here, but anyway, there's a bunch of strip malls across from a big mall. Was redeveloped as Santana Row with some big boxes right at the sidewalk and a street. So the street, if this kind of goes that way, the street gets more and more green and more pedestrian oriented, kind of as you get away from the big nasty arterial, and super high end. Ferragamo, Gucci are in there, very expensive apartments. But having created this urbanism, now the second, third, now fourth phases of this is all office. and that's about to go office. That's already office. A lot more. So the amenity of the office. A lot of folks in San Jose were worried that this project was going to kill market share in downtown. In fact, this is the one exception. In almost every case, the market for urban living is proven in the real downtown, and then the suburbs are the cheaper option. This one suddenly proved the market for urban living in an area. Silicon Valley is not, San Jose is not very known for urban living. They proved it at a super high-end scale in the suburbs, and then downtown suddenly became the place that was able to actually build a lot more affordable urban housing coming in. So it's interesting to just sort of watch these projects. This is another sort of urbanizing of the office park. This project is a small office park, just 3 office buildings next to a mall, next to some 3-story apartment buildings. When a new transit station came in, the property owner said, gee, my surface parking lots don't make sense. I'll tuck them kind of under a hill, a little bit of slightly underground parking, and I'm just going to insert a new main street in between my existing buildings. Now, as an urbanist, I love this project. He didn't tear anything down. He just infilling. And so he sort of built his main street. He put in a lot of new housing, grocery store, cinemaplex. In the process now, the mall is considering extending the street grid. The 3-story apartment buildings have been approved for some 8 and 30-story. A lot of new projects, just boom, 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 kind of flipping around it. So, urbanistically, I love the project. Then I went and visited, and the architect in me wanted to scream. It's like they hired a strip mall architect to design their main street. This is designed as if you're still going 60 miles an hour. Big, simple fonts, big, simple signage, nothing at ground level to reward the pedestrian eye. It's not sustainable, but frankly, I hope it burns down. It's just cheap construction, and they replace it with something better. They've got the bones right of but design matters. And if you want walkability, you've got to reward the pedestrian eye with fine grain, with detail, with care, with this is, of all the office parks, everyone I know at Georgia Tech, my students, if they have to work in an office park, this is the one they want to work in. This is Taxi, outside of Denver. It's a former taxi distribution, basically a big parking lot, auto body repair, kind of thing. So they re-inhabited the old buildings. They've been just bit by bit, incrementally adding new buildings. It's a mix of housing and mostly a lot of office. The big amenity is a swimming pool made of shipping containers. It's very kind of celebrating the kind of industrial site. It screams anti-corporate. This is the opposite of the big glassy office building with the cubicle farm inside. It attracts the entrepreneurial startups, every new biotech, fintech, whatever, all the new startups. This is where they want to be. There's a lot of recycled materials, a lot of constant sort of innovation being expressed through the design that is in turn then also attracting a lot more redevelopment to the entire corridor. 27 more projects. This area is flipping in a pretty dramatic way. But again, just design really does matter. So I'm going to shift now to the challenge of social capital. As I said, everybody thinks of the suburbs as family-focused. In the US now, we're at half of households are 1 to 2 person households. And the assumption in suburbia was that social life would be centered on the schools. But now that most of the households don't have a connection to schools, and you have a lot of much smaller households, people are looking for places to be more social, to connect with community. You've got a lot of lonely folks. And heaven forbid, nightlife in the suburbs. So the changing attitudes. People are, because they don't have kids, they're going out to eat more. There's just a lot more opportunities and desire for that social capital, let alone I think the need for spaces that allow us, allow the suburbs to actually overcome a lot of the social segregation that they've been associated with. This one I just put in because I just love that slide. That somebody built a fire pit in the traffic island in their suburb, and now city council is like, oh shoot, the neighbors really kind of like this, but they didn't ask permission. What do we do? You know, do we let them keep it? It's still there. Last I looked. But you know, people sometimes just go out and just do stuff. You know, we need a place to gather. We're not going to ask permission. Often, I mean, the most sustainable, but also the best way to create places to gather is to re-inhabit the vacant ones that are already there. So this is an old suburban main street of a suburb outside of Cincinnati. The main street, the 3 blocks, had just gone completely vacant until a volunteer group of citizens got it designated as a community entertainment district. That meant that the cost of getting a liquor license went from $25,000 to $2,500. Then they targeted all of the veteran food truck operators and said, are you getting tired of driving around? Would you like a brick and mortar location? And it worked. So now there's the coffee cart, also has the coffee shop. The cheese truck also has a cheese shop. They even got a guerrilla movie theater group to take over the long dead old movie theater. So, you know, but really simple, and it's now a really, you know, a very much a revived little old Main Street. And the same thing sometimes it's more about actually removing some things. So this is Willingboro, New Jersey. This is one of the original Levitt towns, sort of right across the river from Philadelphia. And this was their commercial strip. It just pretty long, it had been dead for quite a while. So they took out one building, created a town green, depaved a lot, put in bioswales. They got a library, they put in a public library into the old Woolworths. They've got a community college, came into, I forget what that one was. This one was a Sears. It's now a big medical clinic. They've also got some new retail in. I mean, just from almost no money, made a town center, and I think really quite remarkable. And sometimes, you know, it can take even really small little moves. Nashville, Tennessee, has quite a few now places where into residential neighborhoods, they're allowing folks to take over a single family lot and put in micro retail, little 400 square foot little cottages that just become these little boutique-y retail, but you know, it's a place to go in the neighborhood. That's one. This is another one, a couple blocks away. So that you get, again, the little guys, and then these guys, like in the middle of the block, they put an open-air pavilion that is a lot of music. It's Nashville, weddings, parties, you know, but a gathering, very simple construction, just gathering spaces inside the neighborhood, just taking up usually one single-family lot. There's also just tons of examples of these I mentioned, but here's one of a dead Walmart turned into a library. And they depaved a lot of the parking lot, again, kind of bioswales. You know, it doesn't have a great walk score given its location, but frankly, the old public library didn't either. Strip malls, there's lots of interesting things happening with strip malls. They were always designed to be convenience retail. You drive in, get your groceries, your pharmacy, your dry cleaning, maybe treat yourself to a coffee now, and, you know, and leave. But again, we're seeing more and more people are eating out more. A lot of restaurants. Restaurants now in the US, actually restaurants have exceeded retail in sales, just in the last year. But nobody really wants to sit at the restaurant and overlook the parking lot. So this one, they cut two little holes, made portals. They turned their back into a second front. It's still the truck dock, but the truck only comes a few times a day. It's not that common. And now those portals have become this fantastic lingering space. Very welcoming, very handy. They've also found that more people from the neighborhood are now walking and biking because the front has become the secondary back. This one was inspired by one in Phoenix. Phoenix has done this on a whole bunch of strip malls, and especially even little micro insertions. At a bigger scale, this project I think is also really quite remarkably well done. This is a developer who mostly they own grocery anchored strip malls, tons of them across the East Coast of the US. They wanted this is their first effort to make a mixed use development in a county that it's also that county's first effort to make a mixed use development. And they really did it, I think, remarkably well. The site used to be a drive-in theater that my husband remembers going to. Then in the 80s, it became a cinemaplex. Then there was a murder at the cinemaplex. Nobody went. That killed the cinemaplex. So it is now a movie theater anchored mixed use development. So there's the movie theater. Here's the town green. And then this building is this one. The ground is completely divided into small scale little boutique shops. Great walkability, really fine grained. This is rewarding the pedestrian eye. This is a street you want to walk along. Lots of ways to engage the eye. Above that, 2 levels of parking and a Target store on the top. The Target is entered through escalators. The Target is doing fantastic. It's the best performing Target in that part of the state. But these are the developers who know grocery stores. They know that you put the milk at the back of the grocery store because you're going to you're taking people who are destination shoppers and you're trying to turn them into an impulse buyer along the way. They're doing the exact same thing now, and they recognize that this is all about impulse purchase. This is what you really need, and you're going to go up there anyway, but they want to try to entice you and make it as pleasant as possible. And they've really done, I think, a remarkable job. This strategy of putting big over small, same thing in the office building that's behind the coffee shop. Can't really see it there, but same thing in the movie theater. They've got restaurants below the movie theater and then the theaters up above. So it's really made this very walkable, accessible public realm. What they also did, which was really clever, and it was a last-minute decision, they decided, that's a movie theater. We've got this big blank wall. Let's put an LED screen, 23-foot LED screen, on the theater addressing our town green. And that's how they're programming and activating their town green. So that they've got the yoga classes in the morning, toddler classes sort of mid-morning, sports at night, or and they're just hitting all the different demographic groups with a lot of programming. And it used to be you just you make a town a green, make it and build it, and they will come. Increasingly, in order to build social capital, we're seeing that you really need to program these public spaces and to try to get as much activation and build a lot more community at different ages, different groups. And they've really done a pretty fantastic job of doing that. This is another example of that program, the importance of programming a public park, but they did this one really quite well. This is Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the sort of industrial fringe area. It's not a particularly suburban area, but the site was a 3-acre truck loading dock, big parking lot. They depaved the parking lot to create a park. In the process of depaving, they put in a lot of geothermal wells. The heating and cooling energy from the geothermal goes to a nonprofit across the street. The nonprofit, in exchange, programs the park and puts on all of the yoga classes and the farmers markets and the food truck rallies. And they really, it helps to boost the whole area now into an emerging arts district, lots of new investment. And it's been so successful now that 5 of the suburbs around Tulsa now have all put in their urban programmed park. And we tend to see this a lot, that it's sort of, something's successful in the downtown, then the suburbs kind of want their version. But the parks, I put this one in as a cautionary tale. Dunwoody is an affluent suburb outside of Atlanta, and it's true they don't have enough parks. They really are very underparked. So their Parks and Rec department said, we really need a baseball park, we need 35 acres, and they targeted the one affordable garden apartment complex in that city. It happened to have about 750 mostly Hispanic school kids. They got enough bad press on the day of the referendum, it did not pass. But I see this all over Atlanta, all over a lot of places. The sort of regreening is used as a vehicle for essentially the newest version of urban removal. It's suburban removal, suburban renewal, especially of the garden apartments. All the other property types that I've shown, clearly, you're not literally displacing anybody. You may be helping to improve property values, indirectly making it more challenging for folks to live. But it's the garden apartments. Now, the garden apartments, a lot of them are moldy, unhealthy places that really should not, we should not be encouraging folks to live in at this point. This one happened to be still in perfectly good shape, and I'm glad that it's still there. Other projects have been embracing the new faces in suburbia, and especially the conversion and re-inhabitation of existing malls into ethnic malls. And I know you've got quite a lot of those here in Toronto. This is an example in Texas, in Fort Worth. Jose Legaspi has done this now in several malls in the US, where there'll still be a number of the traditional mall shops, but he really turns them into community centers. He always has a Spanish-speaking pharmacy, Spanish-speaking lawyers' offices, Spanish-speaking cinema, and a house mariachi band, classes in mariachi, and always a stage. So there's a lot of performance, whether he's bringing in a Mexican wrestler, in this case, or pop star or something. But in Atlanta, he's done one, and all of the protests and rallies against changes to immigration have been at his malls. And he really is taking on that, I think, very important political role, which we so rarely see. Is where do you have a protest in the suburbs? As kind of one of the classic Charles Moore questions from the 70s. And in Atlanta, you have a protest in the suburbs at the ethnic malls. That is where that's happening. So this gets us into the questions of equity and affordability. And I'm running out of time, but I'm really curious and love to see and learn more about the tower renewal efforts here. So here's the Park Forest. Looking forward to seeing more on that. We're seeing other places. In Denver, they're building a lot of light rail, and they also have set up a TOD fund that enables the acquisition of land near future transit stations for affordability. So they're getting out ahead of the transit, but they know it's coming. So here on the parking lot of a mall, there's now been built affordable housing and a library using the TOD fund. And I think these we need a lot more of these kinds of revolving funds to do this kind of stuff. Bernie Sanders actually helped set up a land bank in Burlington, Vermont, when he was mayor there, that has gone on to continue to do a lot. And there's a whole, but this is just one example of many, many motels that are being now, sort of 1960s motels, being converted to housing for the homeless. And basically using the state vouchers, it gives them much more stability to folks to actually have a permanent home, but using the same funding they would have had anyway. This is a relatively affluent community in Rhode Island, small town, that recognized they needed some affordable housing. They targeted the auto body repair lot right, just a block off Main Street. The first proposal came in, standard double-loaded corridor, big hulking box. The neighbors freaked. They didn't want affordable housing in their neighborhood anyway, and you're going to give them that big whale. They then hired one of my former students who gave them a cottage court. Cottage courts are an example of what is increasingly being called missing middle housing, housing that is at a higher density but still fits into a single family lot. We built a lot of it in the 1920s, and it's pretty much disappeared. So this is 15 units on a 1 acre lot. And it's done, but it maintains the scale of the street. It fits in beautifully. It makes a very graceful transition. No one in the neighborhood has complained. And then we also need more people like this woman. She was an investor. Her job is to help invest other people's money into garden apartments. She invested in particular in one in Atlanta. She invested in several, and one in particular outside of it, in Atlanta, near the airport. She noticed that as tenants who were coming to her because they couldn't make rent, she noticed over and over, she got to know them, and she realized they're almost all single moms raising a bunch of kids. They're working $10 an hour jobs at the airport. If one of their kids gets sick, they miss a shift, they lose their job. They have to move, the kids are pulled out of school, very disruptive, all of that. She made one change. She took one unit and turned it into an after-school program. She got people from her church to help man it. She's now done this in quite a few, and the result, just with remarkable ripple effects. The kids are more stable, they're doing better in school. The kids get to know each other. Through that, the parents get to know each other. They cover for each other for shifts. The parents are more stable. Lots and lots of really, really great things. I'm going to just skip this one because it's too long a story and we're running out of water. I want to get to water. The old way of, the conventional way of dealing with water in the suburbs is put everything into a pipe. Often it's even combine your sewer and your sanitary, which is stormwater and your sanitary. Not so good. We're increasingly recognizing we have a lot of places getting too much water, other places getting too little as climate is changing. Lots of problems with water quality, and there's just a lot of things we need to be doing. Park Merced in California is a very large 116-acre apartment complex built in the late 40s. It has had 70 years now of every drop of rainwater on that site being pumped away. Not pumped, piped to the sewer, to the sewer plant, and then it gets mixed in and treated and dumped in the ocean. So in the process, the aquifer is being drained, and the Lake Merced, that it otherwise should be draining into, has dried up. They're actually artificially pumping water in to keep it wet. So they're now. The proposal, they're going to refurbish the existing high-rises, replace all of the low-rise with mid-rise, more than double the residents, but also remove all the pipes. Every bit of the design of this is going into how do we replenish the aquifer, and some really exciting, interesting things, in addition to more transportation and mixed use and all sorts of other. It's a very ambitious, interesting project to watch. Portland, Oregon. We always think of Portland as always doing the most eco thing. Here is another example, but not for the eco reason, which is kind of what's cool about it. So here's even Portland has its version of super blocks on the other side of the river in East Portland. So on the parking lots for this office building, a developer has actually bought 16 acres, 3 big parcels. This is phase 1. And they've now built 3 residential buildings with mixed use at ground floor. They're reinserting at a pedestrian scale green streets that connect through. But what's really unique is they've built the nation's largest living machine. So they're recycling with natural process both the gray water from sinks and showers, but also the black water from the toilets. It's all getting recycled through artificial wetlands that are now exposed on the plaza, cisterns, also capturing all the rainwater. The reason they're doing it is not just because this is eco-oriented Portland, it's because it saves the developer $1.5 million in sewer hookup fees. So the impact fees on the sewer by recycling the water, especially in cities that have combined sewer overflow problems, this becomes pretty significant. The project also has more bike parking than car parking for the residents. It does have a little bit more when you add the residential parking, the retail parking, but pretty cool project. In Atlanta, this is one of many projects we're also seeing these retrofits, building a stormwater park. Atlanta also has combined sewer overflow problem. The city had a 16-acre municipal parking lot. The plan was in the low-lying area, in one of the low-lying areas. The plan had been to build for $35 million an underground tank to just hold stormwater, to release pressure on the sewer system. Instead, some activists proposed, hey, it'll be cheaper to do it open air, which it is. So for $24 million, they were able to build an open air stormwater park that, this thing fills up to there when there's a really bad storm. That now has become an amenity instead of just a tank underground. There's a lot of new development around it. The biggest re-inhabitation project of, 12 million square foot, it's just enormous. Old Sears warehouse is now getting $50 a square foot. It's the highest office rents anywhere in Atlanta because it's also right along the Beltline, which is our transformational rails to trails and soon to be transit. But none of it could have happened without solving the flooding problem, and doing it with a stormwater park was really what was pretty cool. This one, I'm almost done, but I can't not show this one. So most of the projects I've shown, they're not the residential neighborhoods. They're pretty static. There's not a whole lot of change that happens in individual residential neighborhoods. But in Minnesota, Maplewood is a town of 30,000 people, and their watershed authority started a really cool program called Living Streets that it now combines also with the planning and public works. But they take existing residential streets and they build rain gardens and sidewalks inside the right-of-way. So they're narrowing the street. They're getting sidewalks to improve physical activity and accessibility. They're getting the rain gardens in and reducing the discharge to the sewers some 70–80%. That is improving the water quality in their lakes. So it's a really, really cool, project. And then again, there's all these opportunities. So here's aging. This is a dead mall that was built on top of a wetlands. It's been dumping runoff into the lake for decades. This is the main street of this small, pretty affluent town, Wayzata. They're now building senior housing with grocery, with mixed use that's extending the main street, connecting the seniors back into really the town. But they're building the whole thing in pile construction because it is on top of a former wetlands. While they put in the piles, they're also putting in geothermal, so they're getting the renewables. So all of this makes the point that we need to layer these strategies. Now, if I had time, I'd talk more about the public health stuff because there's all sorts of cool stuff. That sort of the aging is getting into some of that. I could talk about the energy opportunities with district systems, renewables. I've mentioned some of those. The opportunities to improve our waste infrastructure and waste systems. I think there's opportunities, but and the whole autonomous vehicles has potential to give us heaven or hell, but we sure as hell better plan for it, I think, to help us. The point really is just we need to start layering solutions. Suburbia was designed, as the transportation folks do their thing, the zoning folks do their thing, water does its thing. Everybody's kind of independently, and it makes it so easy, separate all the uses, it's very easy to reproduce. It's hard to build urbanism. But we need to start layering all of these solutions more. We need to really understand and figure out how to do better on the public-private partnerships. We need to get more departments cooperating, and we need more new measures of success. How do we really start to judge these projects, and especially those of us in the research world? So I've talked way too long. I'll love to take questions.
Thank you. I wish we have more time to allow Island to cover more layers, but I think it would feel incomplete to not having some questions. Yes.
One area you didn't talk about, because I think it's probably too hard,
Mm-hmm.
is very early on in your presentation, you mentioned the traffic and auto dependence, overburdened arterials, underutilized local roads.
Mm-hmm.
Very true where
Mm-hmm.
I live. Is there any successful case histories where that's actually been changed? I understand redeveloping a plaza or whatever, but to take a stable subdivision that's got all curly roads that go nowhere.
The Holy Grail.
Or is it too tough?
I was telling the grad students, the Holy Grail that I am searching for and have yet to find is the connecting up the cul-de-sacs.
Yes.
Haven't
Very
found a
hard.
single example yet.
Right.
I mean, by pathways, yes, but by actual car, no.
That's my sense also.
Yeah.
Too hard.
Especially with, I don't know, I would hope that maybe in other countries, in the US, the private property rights are, it's just that no.
It's too hard here too, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah?
I would like to ask the question about political. So the examples that you gave us were predominantly from relatively progressive places, and you even gave an example of one place where there was originally a streetcar part of the proposal, and because of the shift of politics, it no longer is part of it. So I was wondering, I mean, what about all these places where we don't have progressive politicians or political framework in place? Are they left out, and will the bifurcation continue, or is there some hope?
I'd say the answer, that, you know, I'm pretty optimistic by nature. I think you can kind of tell. But, you know, so the Tulsa example, I mean, Oklahoma is not exactly known as for progressive policies. And I think what's interesting in that case, it was actually a foundation that was leading that project. I'm seeing more and more projects that are being led by nonprofits. And I think there's a lot of room, I mean, in places where the public sector is not leading, there's opportunities for private sector. White Flint, that happened to have also a progressive very progressive public sector, but it was the developers. It was, so in Atlanta, Georgia is very red state, completely, and it's the community improvement districts is our version of business improvement districts, are the main players in all of the retrofitting of suburbia. And I think what happens is that most of that, a more conservative political constituency, if it's their businessmen saying we need to do this and that, they're perfectly fine with it. If they don't trust the politicians and they don't trust the planners necessarily. So I think you'd see different vehicles kind of, you know, in different places that are able to be absolutely, to introduce progressive. I know that within both new urbanism and smart growth, there's a lot of efforts to say this is not, shouldn't be partisan. It's still perceived as partisan, but it certainly shouldn't be. There are a lot of engineers within Congress for New Urbanism who are Republicans, and some of them libertarians, who actually see this as this just plain makes sense. So they're not as opposed. At the same time, I gave a lecture once in Richmond, Virginia, and then the next morning met with elected officials and planning commissioners throughout the region. And one of the elected officials said to me as bluntly as no one else has ever been quite as blunt, but she said, you know, oh, I really, your examples were great. Those were wonderful improvements to those communities. But I think with all those apartments that you showed, that would be mostly Democrats moving into those apartments. And my constituents would not support that. So I cannot support any of the policy changes that would be necessary to do what you've just shown. So there are different attitudes, there are challenges, no question.
I have one question. Donald Trump, in one of the political campaign was intercity. That's one of the campaign he had, the job creation. So, but my question is that if you develop the suburban area like you, a lot of amenities you can create, but you say that that area, the poverty is increasing.
The which is increasing?
The poverty.
Okay, yeah.
Poverty is increasing, especially these old age
Yeah.
senior citizens. So my question is, when you put those lot of amenities there, then the standard of living increased, and the lifestyle cost will increase. So in that situation, how you can balance these two things together? Because the people are dead. No economics is there. So now you're trying to revitalize this thing, but how you can?
You can't bring development to an area where the market is lousy. You can't. There's nothing that in the public sector we can do to absolutely. So that's part of why I really try to emphasize there's re-inhabitation, redevelopment, and regreening. And in a lot of areas where the poverty is really strong, that's where we'll often, I think, see some really great re-inhabitations that help to provide services for the community. We certainly still need, and then gradually, if we can, try to get more mobility opportunities, certainly out to some of those communities. But it is really, I wish I had a silver bullet. I wish I had great examples, but there are no. I mean, I think the reality is the challenge for anyone involved in planning is trying to figure out how do you both get the benefits of gentrification without the displacement. And I know in Arlington County, a very progressive county, they have a 116-point checklist of all of the strategies. There's no one strategy. So along Columbia Pike corridor, when they realized that, the apartments the rents are going up, they ran it through. They've got 116 different strategies they can try to do, but there's no one strategy that works for everybody. There's no, So I'm more worried now. Actually, it's really seeing. Trying to really, I think we still don't know enough, at least I don't know enough, about exactly what suburban poverty looks like. I would say 5 years ago, I thought it was really mostly in those suburban garden apartment communities. Now, as those are getting demolished, I think what I'm seeing is an increase in single-family home rentals. Atlanta we have 30% of single-family homes are rentals, which really quite shocked me. Nationwide, it's 24%, which has also shocked me. And a report just came out for investors saying that the most profitable place in the country to invest in single-family homes as rentals is Clayton County in Atlanta. Clayton County is known to be one of the poor counties, and so it's like, okay, that seems to be where the new face of poverty is. But it keeps moving, it keeps getting pushed out, and it's really hard. I think we need to better understand where is it, what are the needs, and because we don't know what the solutions are yet. And I think we are, because right now I think there's all sorts of great ways to try to preserve existing affordable housing, to try to use inclusionary zoning, 100% replacement units, and things that we should be doing to try to maintain affordable housing. But at the same time, how do we respond to the displacement that is in fact still very, very real and is happening all over?
In Canada, you know that the southern part of this, we have one strategy developed that is intercity link, public transportation system link there, and that actually really created a good job. Those are living a little bit further. So there's, I think, 4 cities, one bus you can move, and with a cheaper price, maybe $2. So that actually really make a good strategy for addressing the poverty. Those are the single mothers or the people.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I've also argued, I wish there was more of, is I think as we retrofit our corridors, and so a lot of those arterials, I mean, nobody wants to live right next to a big, nasty, noisy, and pollution-filled arterial. As we get more and more electric cars so that they're quieter, cleaner, not as obnoxious to live next to, as we retrofit them with more trees, more, make them more safer, then the opportunity to build a lot more affordable housing right along our arterials so that they can be served by bus, if you don't have the full transit, is absolutely, I think, makes a ton of sense. There's bits and pieces. I mean, gas stations are actually one of the property types that are in decline. We're losing a lot more gas stations than we're building because the cars are more efficient, even though we have way more of them. And gas station sites are often, I'm seeing more and more are being converted into often affordable housing along some of those arterials, but not at scale yet. No, absolutely. If you can get the transit connecting, more people use transit when it connects to their work than when it connects to their house. Is actually getting transit to employment, then you help figure out how to get people. People will be more willing to walk the 20 minutes to get to a transit station if on the other end they only have to walk 10 minutes, than vice versa. It's sort of a funny thing. So getting the transit connecting employment makes a ton of sense, and figuring out where and how to get more housing in, absolutely is a good thing. I wish I saw. I see bits and pieces of that happening, but I want to see more of it on the corridors too, because I think there's a need for it.
My question is about the incentives of the private sector, or where the market can contribute to this regeneration project. Mostly two strategies of intensification and commercialization are applied to bring in private sectors. In the economies which face crisis, both in the housing sector and also in the commercial, it's not only the big corporation which are involved in retail, but also the small retail sector. In the cases that you invite developers to bring, for example, high-rises or new design, a small design, but still for commercial units. Were there examples which actually the investments goes to create a new dead mall or a new dead commercial sector? I mean, you are following this project. I understand that there is a history to each project, but in many cases, actually, in other parts of the world, there are building dead malls, which you can see it's under construction, but it would be dead.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, malls. It's amazing how many, especially in Asia, how many malls are being built. In Asia, India, Brazil are still building malls at a very rapid pace, and they're dying at an even more rapid pace than the U.S. ones. But if your question is whether in the retrofits are we seeing much death, there are a few cases where certainly the recession hit in the U.S. much higher. It was a really big deal in Atlanta. Different cities that kind of hit harder, and there were a lot of projects that were delayed that are now back and going all guns. And there were some of them, I think, made it harder for the cities to pay back their bonds because there's not as much, everything's been delayed. So there's some cash flow issues, but boy, they're pumping in tons of revenue now. So I haven't seen actual dead. I've just sort of seen quite a lot. There are quite a lot of stalled projects, but remarkably few actual failures. There are projects that just never get off the ground, a lot because a community wants, we've got a dead mall right now. So Cleveland, Ohio, There's a consortium of 8 suburban communities that kind of ring Cleveland. They have a league of the suburban mayors, and they've asked me to consult with them. Each one of those mayors has a dead mall. I think 6 of them are dead malls. 1 is a strip mall and 1 is an office park. But it's based, when polled, every single of those mayors saying, well, what do you think will, not should, but will happen, happen to your mall? Oh, mixed use. No way is that going to happen. There's a complete wishful thinking, but I'm excited by the prospect that at least they are talking as a region. I think that maybe we can get into some kind of regional profit sharing, kind of like St. Paul and Minneapolis have. But I mean, these are, especially when you're talking the malls, they operate within a regional system. And so you really do need to think of the reuses in a regional way. But an area like Cleveland is still losing population. So it's a zero-sum game. I would much rather let those malls go dead and revitalize their main streets and their small suburban cores. The city is actually doing quite well. Downtown Cleveland is reviving. And there's quite a lot of new population growth and things. And but how those mayors can get convinced to not push for projects that ultimately, where they're all just going to be competing against each other and none of their projects will do very well, becomes the real kind of political game. So again, in areas of stagnant or declining population, I do not recommend redevelopment of suburban properties. And that's really important. But to recognize that still those communities need some things, but they don't necessarily, the answer is not just redevelopment.
We only have time for one question, and that will be from Lisa.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. So many of these malls that are vacant now used to fulfill functions of public spaces. So it's my sense, and I was recently in Santana Row in San Jose, that obviously there are new public spaces that are being built and provided and are walkable. But my sense is that they're only fulfilling the function of public space for a more affluent and a new type of consumer, and are also associated to spaces of consumption.
Mm-hmm. Just like the malls.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, how can we sort of make sure that these spaces are a little bit more inclusive to fulfill public space functions for sort of a broader, public.
I mean, so the malls are not, well, I don't know in Canada. In the US, it actually varies by state whether malls are required to operate as truly public spaces. Most of the states in the US actually very much allow a mall. They can protest. People. There was a guy wearing a peace symbol on a T-shirt who was kicked out of a mall, and the mall, it was held up to be that was the right of the mall because it was during a time when a lot of protests were going on. I mean, so malls are not. Most of the malls are certainly not public space. Right. But they do. And the mall walker, a lot of the seniors who do the mall walking, and that's been the attitude of the courts, is absolutely, hey, if you are pretending to be public space, you have to also allow people to protest. You have to allow the Santa Clauses with, collecting change, which the malls have been most malls were trying to ban. So that part is a whole complicated issue, but absolutely no. Santana Row is the most affluent of all the retrofits anywhere. It is in fact open. They cannot kick you out. Anyone can hang out, in there. They actually, and that one has been tested. The question of, I think it is pretty interesting on a lot of these projects. So I always emphasized when in fact the streets are public streets that are going in. If the property if it's a retail developer who is redeveloping that property, chances are they actually want to keep ownership of the streets because they believe they can maintain them to a higher standard than what they trust the public sector to do. So, and actually that was the case even also in the little office park in Maryland that had the ugly looking strip mall architect Main Street. It's privately owned streets, but the owner wanted the police to still police the street. So we worked out a deal that the police department gets the parking meter revenue and then in exchange. So you get all these weird hybrids. Is that a public street? Is that a private street? It's publicly policed, it's privately owned. All of these things get really, really murky. Then you get streets that are publicly owned, but are still, it's the business improvement district, which is actually managing all of the beautification and the flowers and the planters and the, and all of this stuff. So, and they will set up you set up some very different rules. To me, of course, it's all about trying to ensure accessibility to folks. But I mean, the fact that these places don't have doors and don't have gates, to me, is going an enormous step. If you're at least having a social space, I know from just talking with tons of folks that even if Starbucks, obviously, it's not public space, but it serves a social function. These murky lines are still don't mean that you can do just absolutely anything and free. Everybody's free to do whatever they want in public space and completely constrained in private space. So anyway, I do think there's a lot of design issues we can do to just try to make the most important thing I think is to make people feel welcome. And I love the definition that going back to Jane Jacobs and others, but that Jane Jacobs wrote about how that in great public spaces, mostly the streets, is where a stranger is not just welcomed, but a stranger is adding to the safety and the vitality of that street. Whereas we've gotten to this point where we assume that strangers are negatives. And she really was making the case, no, you want the more strangers on a street, that's more eyes on the street, that's more businesses, people supporting local businesses, that's more activity. And so the question is, how do you actually design to invite strangers? And a lot of that is by just the simple fact of having benches, having comfortable streetscaping and street furnishings on the streets, having activities in public spaces. I have forever jealous of one thing between men and women. There's one thing I'm really jealous of men, and it's pickup basketball. Men are willing to take off their shirts, play basketball and sweat with strangers in pickup games in public, and women have nothing equivalent. And if we can figure out that, then we'll have, I think, really great and more equitable public spaces.
Please join me to thank Ellen for this wonderful presentation and discussion. Thank you, Ellen. And thank you all for coming to this talk.